What is up, academic astronomy? It is Mr. Krug coming to you today from my back sun porch. Weather is so nice outside, I want to enjoy it. Plus, some of my daughters are playing outside. So I just need to sit here so I can zoom to watch them to make sure they're not getting hauled away by a bear or playing with any neighbor kids that I don't know. So today we are going to be talking to you about the last section of the notes, section 9, Search for Extraterrestrial Life. So once again, I'm going to break this into 3 separate lectures. You're going to have questions to answer along the way. And a little disclaimer, I'm going to do my best to show you both sides of the story for this one, but I also think we have some really compelling evidence throughout history that there's a chance that we are not alone in the universe. But I'm going to try to give you all sides of that. So let's skip over to the actual lecture, which I'm going to do with a share screen here. So I am posting this lecture for you on Google Classroom as a PDF. So if you want to follow along with me, that would be totally awesome. So we start with 2 really good quotes. The first from science fiction master Arthur C. Clarke, and the second from the man Carl Sagan. And I like Sagan's claim, but I also think that this quote has been abused somewhat by the mainstream. Like a lot of mainstream astronomers would say, well, I would believe in UFOs, but there's no evidence. I think in this section, you'll see that there's a lot of evidence that at least something unexplained is going on. So a couple terms we have to use here that are sometimes used interchangeably, but they mean slightly different things. Extraterrestrial, extra meaning outside or beyond, terra is Latin for the earth. So this, if we're talking about extraterrestrial life, this would be life originating from outside or beyond the earth. And that is often mentioned in conjunction with UFOs, unidentified flying objects. Now notice, guys and girls, that UFO does not directly say alien. So it could be something that's quite earthbound, but it's just not able to be identified at that time. Like, for example, during my lifetime, I have probably seen maybe 2 to 3 unidentified flying objects, but I think at least 2 of them had a very earthly explanation. Now, first, let's talk about aliens as it relates to the mainstream. Our chances of finding other life out there are greater than you think, but it also gets a lot more complex. So this baller that you see right here was a pioneer in radio astronomy named Frank Drake. He and Carl Sagan were homeboys, and they worked together on something called the Drake equation, which now bears his name. And this gave the ballpark possibility at how much life might be out there. Now, you don't have to solve the equation. Frank Drake did that for us, but his answer is very compelling and thought-provoking. So Drake's equation solves for NC, number of communicative civilizations in a galaxy. So communicative, that would mean able to communicate. Drake and Sagan's working premise was, because the stars are so far apart, and because we as humans are not even close yet to interstellar travel, that we would need another civilization to be able to communicate long distance with us. So notice, everybody, this isn't for all life, only life that could communicate with us. Secondly, notice it's not for the entire universe. It's only galaxy by galaxy. Drake and Sagan believed that the galaxies were so far apart that even if we did master interstellar travel, it would be unlikely to ever communicate with a civilization from another galaxy. Even the most ambitious science fiction, like the iconic blue words that always begin most Star Wars movies, only talk about single galaxies, not communicating between them. So on the other side of the equation then, our number is going to start quite large. N star means number of stars in a galaxy. For a galaxy like our Milky Way, it might be 100 billion stars, a 1 followed by 11 zeros. For a galaxy like Andromeda, it might be 1 trillion stars, a 1 followed by 12 zeros. But then notice, every time we multiply by a fraction, at least if the denominator is larger than the numerator, our number is going to get smaller. So we next multiply by FP, fraction of those stars that have planets going around them. Now, I think somebody today in modern times needs to revise the Drake equation. Because understand, when Drake and Sagan came out with this, they had not yet officially confirmed the first extrasolar planet. And the thought in the mainstream was that other planets around other stars would be very rare. We are now finding it's quite the opposite. Planets are very commonplace. In fact, it's getting difficult for astronomers to find stars that don't have planets around them. So in reality today, here in 2020, FP would probably be a lot higher than it was when the equation was made. We then multiply by NLZ, the number of those planets in a life zone around another star. You might remember from the last section, this is also known as the Goldilocks zone, the area around a star that's not too hot, not too cold, but it's just right for liquid water and life. We then multiply by FL, fraction of those life zone planets where life actually begins. So think about our own solar system and look at how quickly the numbers go down. We start now with officially 8 planets. Out of those 8, how many are in our sun's life zone? At most 2, Earth and maybe Mars. Now from there, where did life begin? Well, I personally think there might still be at least microbial life on Mars, but it hasn't been proven to the public, so we would say just 1 planet. So we went from 8 to 2 down to 1 planet that quickly. We then multiply by FI, fraction of life that evolves to intelligence. Now, when you look at the Earth today and you look at the headlines and all the famine and fighting and pollution and war that goes on, maybe you could say humans aren't really that intelligent in the grand scheme of things. But we think here we need at least human level intelligence to be able to communicate with other stars. Outside of humans, probably dolphins and chimpanzees are the smartest species here on Earth. But until we see a bunch of dolphins building a huge radio telescope in the ocean with their cute little bottle noses, or a bunch of chimpanzees building one out in the jungle, as far as we know, humans are the only species on Earth that can communicate with the stars. Finally, everybody, and you probably wouldn't think about this, but this might be the biggest factor of all, fraction of star life in which beings can communicate. To the best of our knowledge, our planet has been around about 4.5 billion years. Out of that 4.5 billion years, how long have we been able to communicate with the stars? The answer is only about 80 years. So 80 years out of 4.5 billion. Divide that sometime on a calculator for yourself to see how humblingly small an amount of time that actually is. So understand, our communication window has to be open, but it basically has to line up then with the window from another civilization. Like maybe 2,000 years ago, there was a civilization close to us that could have communicated, but maybe they accidentally blew themselves up with nuclear weapons. Or maybe 500 years from now, there's another civilization near us that gets to the point that it can communicate. But maybe by then there's been an asteroid strike, or there's some type of runaway global warming, and the only humans who are left are living down under the ground just trying to survive. So Drake's equation, this last variable, means your civilization's window has to be open, but it's got to match up with a civilization from, or a window from another civilization as well. So Frank Drake did run some numbers here, and he believed, according to his equations, there could be anywhere from 0.00002 up to 10 million civilizations in the Milky Way that could communicate with us. Now, you might think to yourself, well, geez, thanks for that, Frank Drake. That's a pretty big range. But understand a couple things here. Number one, notice the bottom end is not 0. It's almost 0, but not quite. So I think that proves there has to be life somewhere out there. And as we learn more about extrasolar planets and we see how many are orbiting other stars and how many of those planets are a lot like Earth, I think by the time you teens are old and gray, we'll have a pretty good idea of how much life there is out there, at least in our part of the Milky Way. So how do astronomers go about finding these potential worlds where life might begin? Our next section is on locating extrasolar planets. So remember, extrasolar means outside or beyond. These, everybody, are planets found beyond our own solar system, most of them orbiting around other stars. So it might surprise you to learn that most planets have not been found by an astronomer peering through an eyepiece and seeing a bunch of little dots going around a distant star. In fact, as far as I know, only about 10 extrasolar planets so far have actually been found visually. All the rest of them are indirect methods. And the most popular way to do it so far is called, number one, the radial velocity or wobble method, or sometimes called the Doppler method. So just like our sun is pulling on Earth and the other planets, allowing it to stay in orbit, we tend to forget those planets are actually pulling on the star a tiny amount as well. So basically, everybody, a star with planets around it will make a slight wobble as they orbit, whereas a star with no planets will just sit more or less perfectly still as it rotates. So astronomers can actually measure how much the star is wobbling, and that can give them an idea on how many planets are actually orbiting around it. That's the most successful method to date. Our second method is the second most successful method. This is called the transit method. And you all might recognize this diagram over here. It's very similar to when we talked about eclipsing binary star systems in the last section. So here, if a planet passes in front of a distant star, it will temporarily dim down the brightness of that star every time the planet crosses in front of it. Now, I have read it's such a tiny amount, it would be the equivalent of seeing a ladybug crawling across the headlight of a car from over a mile away. And yet our telescopes now are good enough that they can actually do this. Now, this is both good and bad. On one hand, remember, there's no such thing as up or down in outer space. We might have a star system relative to us where the planet is orbiting its star like this, and we would never actually see the eclipse happen. But the bonus is, if we do get the nice line of sight to see that planet pass right in front of another star, right at this point, just as it starts to grow in front of another star, check out the diagram right here in position number 2. Basically, the star's light would pass through the atmosphere of that planet, and the gases in that planet's atmosphere would suck out different wavelengths of light. And this can actually allow astronomers to figure out what the atmosphere of a distant world looks like that's dozens of light years away. Method 3 has not been used very much, but pulsar timing is fairly famous because the first extrasolar planet was found in this way. So if you remember a spinning neutron star pulsar, if it's like pulse, 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 astronomers know there might be something orbiting around it, pulling on it, and affecting its pulse time. That's how the first ever one was found. Thank you, Albert Einstein, for number 4. Large masses can actually bend the fabric of space-time like a pair of glasses or a contact lens, and it can create a lens allowing astronomers to see far more distant locations. That's called a gravitational microlens. And we have 3 other ideas so far that have worked as well, and new planet hunting methods are being devised all the time. All right, so that's the mainstream approach. Now, everybody, let's talk a little bit about the current debate with extraterrestrial life. And some people have remarked that 2020 is so crazy because as I'm making this, a couple weeks ago, the US government admitted that one of the UFO videos released by Tom DeLonge's To the Stars Academy, the so-called Tic Tac video, was actually a genuine UFO. And they didn't say what it was, but they said it was no conventional aircraft. They did not know what it was. And so some people are saying 2020 is so crazy, the government is basically admitting that some UFOs are real and nobody's even paying attention. So why would there be pushback? Why would there be pushbacks from governments of the world? Why would there be pushbacks from the mainstream scientific community? Well, what I can say about the history of science is any time that a big group of people falls into what we call groupthink, which basically means all thinking the same way without questioning. That's when progress really slows. Like, for example, you might recall during origins of astronomy. It's not actually Nicholas Copernicus, the Polish astronomer and mathematician, who figured out the sun was at the center of our solar system. Who discovered it first was a Greek scientist named Aristarchus of Samos. And he discovered it almost 2,000 years before Copernicus rediscovered it. But his idea was suppressed. And so anytime this happens, this is how science really slows down. So usually if you see a headline about a UFO sighting, right away they trot out a scientist or an astronomer somewhere to basically ridicule it and dismiss it. But why would that be? Well, I can tell you, there's a lot of scientists that truly do believe in the reality of UFOs, but they still cannot openly discuss that. There's peer pressure at play. If you think high school is bad for peer pressure, the scientific community is far worse than that. And number two, unless you have a scientist that's perhaps doing research for a certain drug company, most research-based scientists at some level receive some amount of government funding. And so far, since the government's official position is that UFOs don't exist, then as a scientist, you have to be really, really careful to make that claim publicly. You might lose some of your funding. Finally, number three, I personally think for a lot of scientists, the reluctance is there's a real threat of obsolescence. The root word of obsolescence is obsolete, to basically make not needed anymore. And so think about what makes a scientist in our society. They are very smart, well-educated men or women that have spent a lot of years in schooling, and many of them are now experts in their field. But what if we met a civilization that was 500 years ahead of us, or 1,000 years, or even 10,000 years? What if this civilization is so open with us to try to jumpstart the Earth, they're willing to share a lot of their discoveries with us? Suddenly, a lot of scientists here on Earth would no longer have jobs or a place in society. And it's not just astronomers. What if you had a really prominent oncologist, let's say a cancer researcher, and she was very, very close to a breakthrough for one type of cancer? She might not want aliens to exist either, because what if another civilization came here and said, "Greetings, people of Earth, we are real. We are here and we are here to help you. And as a sign of our goodwill, here is the cure for all cancers, which we discovered 500 years ago." So I think it's unspoken, but in the scientific community, there is a genuine fear that another civilization could make them obsolete. Now, how about governments of the Earth? So a lot of times with alien life, cover-ups come up. Well, there's a potential. If there is more advanced technology, especially if some of it has crashed to Earth in the past, that could give great power to whatever nation was able to harness it. There is also an equal threat of the same thing happening in enemy nations. So if you look back through now declassified documents from the 1940s and 1950s, one of the biggest concerns from the United States about UFOs wasn't the UFOs themselves, but it was the possibility of one of these things crashing in Russia and the Soviets being able to reverse engineer that technology as well. Number three, as we're seeing with the shutdown that currently leaves us out of school, there's always the potential for mass panic in the populace anytime there's some new obstacle. So a lot of people feel that human beings would just not be able to handle the reality that we're not alone in the universe. And then number four, how many of you have ever told a little white lie to your parents and you think to yourself, you know what, I'm going to tell them the truth at some point. But then you have to lie a little bit more to cover the first lie. And then it just becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where you're in too deep, you can never tell the truth. Some feel that that's actually happened here on the Earth and it's been covered up for so long. Now we really can't say what happened because then the public would really be upset. So the last little bit I wanted to talk about here before we draw this first lecture to a close is a very popular but controversial idea that's really hit the mainstream with the prevalence of a History Channel show of the same name, and that's Ancient Aliens. This is an idea that not only are there other civilizations out there, but they've actually been coming to Earth for a very long time. maybe even thousands or tens of thousands of years. So this idea is really founded by two different researchers. One is named Zecharia Sitchin. He did some very controversial translations of some ancient Sumerian cuneiform tablets. You hear Sitchin's name come up a lot with the idea of planet X or Nibiru. But the man we want to talk about today is this Swiss researcher named Erich von Däniken. As a young man, von Däniken saved up every penny he could while working as a clerk in a hotel in Switzerland. And he used this money to be able to travel the world and visit lots of different archaeological sites and see them in person. And so von Däniken, in a way, has a very simple idea, but it's also very profound. Up until von Däniken, anytime we would read these spectacular ancient accounts, the assumption was that this was just ancient science fiction, folklore that people used to pass the time. Von Däniken, though, has a very different take. He said, wait a minute, what if our ancestors were actually telling the truth? What if they were describing things the best they could, but they were encountering civilizations of such power that their writings seem very fanciful today? Now, this leads a lot of people to assume that von Däniken was an atheist that didn't believe in God. But that could not be further from the truth. Von Däniken once said, my version of God does not need a craft to travel around in from place to place. So basically, according to von Däniken, sometimes the confusion is these beings seem so powerful that at least some cultures were mistaking them for the gods. So just to give you a couple interesting cases here from very ancient times as we round out our lecture today. This first one fascinates me. It is from the Mesozoic era. This is called the London artifact. So the Mesozoic would date to a time back when the dinosaurs were on the earth. So it dates anywhere from 144 million to 65 million years ago. So it was found in Cretaceous age rock, and it is quite clearly a hammer, and it is now on display in a London museum. And what's even more amazing about this hammer, because understand, even the earliest humans, as we understand evolution, should not have been around for more than about 2 million years. So this would predate even the earliest hominid by at least 63 million years. But one time a team of scientists actually got permission to take a tiny corner off this hammer and actually test the iron. And it's very high quality metal. It's almost pure iron. And it hasn't even rusted where they cut it in over 60 years. And rust-proof iron is still something we can't make today. Or how about these pictures over here on the left? I'm sure that you've all seen geodes somewhere, even if it was just in a gift shop at maybe a cave somewhere. Have you ever imagined cracking open a geode and seeing what looked like a little spark plug inside? So this is called the Koso artifact. And these are actual images of what was found in this geode, which dates back at least 500,000 years. It looks like it has a hexagonal ceramic casing, just like a spark plug today. And it has some very fine machining inside, including a metal spring. And so a lot of times these things are just called oop art, because it's basically like, oops, why is that there? But the frustrating thing to me is, instead of this being a way for the scientific community to really open up and think to themselves, maybe we haven't evaluated everything correctly. Anything like this that doesn't fit into the standard picture is just basically ignored. Finally, on this page, everybody, we have what were called the Dropa stones. So these are very odd. I have a picture of the stones here. In a cave in China, were these large circular stones found with grooves in them that looked like a telegraph record. The grooves had strange symbols like hieroglyphs, and anytime you would play the stones on a phonograph, they would actually make a sound. And by basically translating these pictorial symbols, it told a story of a crash landing of a spaceship. And the inhabitants tried to converge and meet with some of the early humans they saw. But because they looked so different, they were basically tracked down and killed. Now, mainstream archaeology has commented on this site. They said that the skeletons found in these caves, which were buried in neat rows, were just the skeletons of apes. But it's a very controversial site because over here at the right, you can actually see one of the skeletons from the caves. And not only does it not really look like an ape, but apes do not bury their dead in neat rows. Adding to the intrigue, all of the Dropa stones are now missing. They were on a display in a museum in China, and they are now gone, and nobody knows where they went to. You might recall in the winter sky, we talked about the mystery of Sirius B, the tiny white dwarf companion to bright Sirius A. It's impossible to see it with the naked eye, yet the Dogon tribe of Africa somehow knew about the existence of that star centuries before telescopes were invented, and they claim that their ancestors actually came from a planet around Sirius B and helped bring civilization here. So that, of course, leads us to the Egyptian pyramid complex, always a great site of fascination and ancient alien lore. There's a lot of debate on the pyramids. We've already talked about them in class. I will say that the mainstream interpretation that these were burial places for pharaohs has far less concrete evidence behind it than you would actually think. For starters, there's no hieroglyphics found in any of the three great pyramids describing what they were actually used for. And the one hieroglyph that actually related the pyramids to the time of King Khufu may have actually been intentional graffiti placed there by the British archaeological team who was exploring the pyramids. Some believe now there's a chance the pyramids date back much, much earlier than 3000 BC. And a lot of that evidence comes from the base of the Sphinx. When it was rediscovered in modern times, sand had basically buried it up to the head. And now the entire body's been excavated. And down at the base of the feet, we have stone that's been worn away by a flood. But the problem is, the last time this part of the Giza Plateau flooded was around 10,000 BC. So that's a bit of a problem because it somehow means we have a structure built and showing evidence of an event that happened 7,000 years before it was officially constructed. So some believe that we are missing the point of the pyramids, which are now showing up in lots more countries than just Egypt and throughout South America. They found them in China. They found some controversial pyramids in Southern Europe. And so some believe these were either tremendously large aerial markers, or they could have even been power plants as part of a worldwide grid, like what the incredible inventor Nikola Tesla envisioned back in the early 1900s. So taking a look at my questions real quickly here, just have to see how much more I have to get through the notes. Let's see here. All right, we just have one more page of the notes to get through here before we ask our 10 questions. So next up, we have some rather unusual paintings from the oldest unaltered culture here on Earth, Australian Aborigines. These, everybody, are the Kimberley petroglyphs. So they are rock paintings left in Kimberley, Australia. And they apparently show the Wandjina, which were the gods of the Australian Aborigines. And so all these images over here to the right are some of these petroglyphs. And they appear to show a bright orange halo, not just around the head, but also around the eyes as well. Now over here at the left, and this is the only time I'm going to show one, because I apologize, I know they're creepy, is a drawing of what some people describe today when they supposedly encounter a gray extraterrestrial. And notice the uncanny semblance, and yet these paintings that you see to the right were done 5,000 years earlier than the drawing to the left. So think about what a halo actually represents. Today, we're always used to seeing it in religious art, but in ancient times, anytime a halo was shown, it represented either a god or a being from the sky. So one interpretation from ancient aliens enthusiasts of sites like this is they were actually seeing another civilization here, But much like our Apollo astronauts had to wear spacesuits on the moon, the beings who were here actually were wearing glass helmets because they could not breathe our air. Our ancestors basically depicted that helmet by a big circle around the head, and that's what led to the idea of the halo. And so a number of religious texts actually have some evidence of very high technology. So here in the Western Hemisphere, we think a lot about the Bible, but in the Eastern Hemisphere, one of the longest, oldest holy books are the Indian Vedic texts. And quite openly, the story arc weaving through them is one between a battle of good and negative extraterrestrial forces. And they describe Vimanas, these enormous flying machines, right down to actual detailed blueprints of what they looked like. And according to these Vedic texts, they could do many things that people describe seeing UFOs do today. They could accelerate and turn and corner and bank rapidly. They could fire weapons of enormous power. They could leave the Earth and visit other planets and even other star systems. Now, luckily, the Vedic texts have somewhat of a happy ending. Eventually, positive extraterrestrials intervene here to banish the negative ones from the Earth. But just understand for the time being, the idea of UFOs is not a new one. It's preserved in some of the oldest writings throughout history. And finally, now the last place we'll talk about before we have our first 10 questions. Everybody focuses on the pyramids in Egypt, but in some ways, those on the continent of South America are even more spectacular. The blocks are larger. Sometimes they aren't just cubes, but they actually look like intricate Lego blocks, except they're dozens of tons and made of stone. At some, like this middle site you see, this is at Sacsayhuaman in Peru, actually show where it looks like blocks of stone are basically melted and poured into place. At other ones, like this one to the right, this is Tiwanaku, Bolivia, it shows cutting of this hard granite igneous rocks in ways that we still can't do today, even with our best laser-guided diamond-tipped drills. And so we really have some high-end technology. Even in some of these pyramids, there have been little gold amulets found, which are officially birds. Yet, unlike a bird, they appear to have a vertical stabilizer fin on them, just like a modern airplane. Back in the 90s, a team of engineers actually recreated one of these to its exact proportions and then attached a model airplane propeller. And to their shock, it actually flew with perfect aerodynamics. Unfortunately, once that happened, all of these pendants they had on display in the Smithsonian, much like the Dropa stones in China, totally disappeared. So a lot of mystery and intrigue here with the South American pyramids as well. Okay, at this point, we are going to switch over to the 10 questions that I have for you. These 10 questions are going to be on Google Classroom, but only the answers are going to be. So you have to watch this part to actually get the questions. Locked mode is not enabled, so you can pause at any time you would like. As I take a drink break from my NASA coffee mug here. Okay, question number 1. What does UFO stand for? What does UFO stand for? Feel free to pause the video and answer in Google Classroom. Question number 2. Created by pioneers in radio astronomy, this equation gives us the scientific probability of finding life elsewhere. Question 2. Question 3. Measuring the shaking of a star as it's pulled on by the planets orbiting it. This is the most successful method of locating extrasolar planets today. Question 3. Question 4. This method of planet finding is also very successful and carries the added bonus of being able to infer an extrasolar planet's atmosphere. Question 4. Question 5. Peer pressure, government funding, and a threat of obsolescence may lead this group to be overly critical of the UFO phenomenon. Question 5. Question 6. This controversial but popular theory questions whether fantastic legends from the ancients were actually describing real encounters with spectacularly advanced civilizations. Question 6. Question 7. Although modern civilization officially did not begin until about 6,000 years ago, this artifact may be upwards of 144 million years old and appears to be made of rust-proof iron. Question 7. Question 8. Some believe these structures served as power plants or gigantic aerial markers from space, as there is no direct evidence correlating them as burial spots for rulers. Question 8. Question 9. These rock paintings appear to be one of the first uses of a halo in art and bear an uncanny semblance to what modern eyewitnesses describe as extraterrestrials 5,000 years later. Question 9. And finally, question 10. Unlike those found in Egypt, pyramids on this continent are larger with more complex blocks and often built on perilous mountaintops where it would be impossible to sustain large labor forces. Question 10. Okay, everybody, thanks for sticking around for this lecture. Sorry if it got a little bit long, but always get really, really excited talking about the possibility of extraterrestrial life. This was part 1 of a 3-part series on our final section of notes for the year. So make sure you answer those 10 questions in Google Classroom, and we'll see you in just a bit for part number 2. Peace.